Reasons preferences are mercifully very nicely organized, especially compared to some other music software, and basically just has 5 sections. Now, a lot of this you don't have to get too involved in unless you really want to. There's some interesting options. Default song here. If you start new projects a lot, as many people do, you might want to automatically have it open up with an empty rack, or to open up the last song you were working on, which is quite handy. You can set the CPU usage limit here. That doesn't mean, that's not an absolute CPU usage, that's the audio engine. So if you set that to no limit, that doesn't mean it's going to blow up your computer. It just means that it will use as much as it can without bringing the rest of the system to its knees. To be honest, Reason is very kind to your CPU compared to some other music software. And even with things like time stretching and synthesis going on a modern computer, you can generally get an awful lot of devices and tracks running before you'll start to notice any kind of problem. And you probably never will, to be honest. Part of that is thanks to things like this here. The option to use multi-core audio rendering. This happens to be a quad-core laptop, but most computers now are at least dual-core. So you shouldn't have any problems with that, really. These options at the top are really just sort of cosmetic things that you can tweak if you want. Audio. It's rare that you would want to change the master tuning of Reason. I mean, you can do if you want. That would be more to do with incorporating audio material that had been recorded somewhere else out of tune, perhaps. Relatively rare thing to want to do. Your audio device should pop up here. Mine happens to be a Zyio synth. Sample rate 44.1, which is CD quality. Buffer size is a big thing with music software. A lower buffer size means lower latency, but also a higher CPU load. A higher buffer size means a lower CPU load, but potentially a higher latency when recording and when playing MIDI in. Modern hardware should be able to easily cope with 256 samples, which is a latency so low that you won't notice it, basically. You can manage the way that your audio interface interacts with Reason using the active input and output channel sections. Mine happens to only have 2. At least the interface I'm using at the moment happens to have 2. Yours might have more than that. This is important when you're doing things like recording a drum kit, for example, because for something like that you would need 6, 7 mics, maybe. So you'd need to have an audio interface with enough inputs to cope with all those at once. If you're just working with MIDI and maybe a mic or a guitar, then you can get away with 2 ins, 2 outs, maybe 4 ins, something like that. Monitoring is important to know about for when you are listening back. 3 options here. Automatic means record-enabled tracks are automatically monitored. And what that means is as soon as you record-enable a track, you will hear back what's coming through it. The manual option does the same thing, except only when you press the monitor button. And this is important for things like audio recording, where you don't want to necessarily automatically have monitoring switched on when you select a channel. If you've got your speakers on, you could get feedback. And the third option, which you may want to use, although this is tied in with routing sound out to a hardware mixer, is external monitoring. And what that does is that means that all your monitoring is done through some sort of external hardware. And though that's possible, it's not that common actually these days with Reason, especially not with its new mixer. Control surfaces we've looked at already a little bit. This is where you manage the MIDI keyboards and devices which fire MIDI into your system. The advanced settings menu is to do with controlling Reason's devices from an external sequencer. So if you've got a hardware sequencer or drum machine or something like that, you can fire MIDI in and control it that way. It's actually more common these days to use Rewire, which is Propellerhead's protocol for communicating between other DAWs like Cubase, Logic, or Pro Tools in and out of Reason. So this section is a little bit of a hangover from the old days. When you record audio, it's placed into Scratch folders, and then when you save a project, it's actually stored inside your project file. This also sets where you save analysis data and new and unsaved songs. The default is to use your computer's hard drive, and that's a fairly safe option. You can set this to an external drive if you plan to keep all your recordings on an external drive. That's entirely up to you. And finally, the keyboard option. This relates to the on-screen computer keyboard for playback that we looked at earlier on, and you can modify how that works here, although, to be honest, it's pretty good left as it is for most people. So that's a quick tour of the preferences. Let's finally, for this section, just have a quick look at the sound banks.